So as Amanda said, I'm going to be talking today about identifying groups that use the internet, those that don't, and taking action on the data. So just to set a little bit of an agenda, we're going to set the context, talk a little bit about what we've seen with internet connectivity during the pandemic and going forward as well, some of the studies that have been done in the last year or two, and then we'll dig into the data a little bit more. We'll use the Gale Public Library, which is a fictitious library around our office in Farmington Hills, to discuss how to use the data, how to kind of maneuver around the dashboard a little bit to identify some of the groups that use the internet and don't, and then we will dig into the segmentation portal together to get to know those groups a little bit more, understand the best way to support them, as well as the best way to communicate with them. So let's talk a little bit about internet connectivity during the pandemic. With the onset of the global pandemic, things changed really quickly, and mainstream internet connectivity was more important than ever. We saw that schools were moved to remote learning environments. We saw that some jobs, a really big portion of jobs, were transitioned to work from home. We saw that many Americans were affected financially through job loss, furlough, and reduced hours. For this group in particular, connection to the internet was necessary to access job search resources, as well as to communicate with potential new employers. We also saw that social distancing was enforced across the country. So that was making remote communications the only form of socialization and connection for many adults and children in the US. So, I want to talk a little bit about one of the studies that Amanda and I were actually discussing last week, which was really interesting. We talked a lot in our previous webinars. As Amanda said, this is our 5th in the series. And so we talked a lot about, different groups that were disproportionately affected by the pandemic. And 2 of those groups were low-income households as well as low education level households. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about today was how we see those patterns kind of mirror when we look at internet access at home. Every year we see some annual published reports that come from the FCC, and what they do is they talk about the state of broadband deployment in the country. And one of the last reports that they published was from 2019, and they talk a little bit about how the proportion of population with access to different speeds of internet service is actually the highest in counties with the highest median household income and the lowest poverty rates. And so I pulled this chart here for us to look at together to talk about how we saw the percent of adults who have home broadband users over time and how that differs between the different income brackets that we have listed here. So you'll see that it's directly correlated, right? We see that those with lower income brackets are less likely to have broadband internet at home, and those with the highest $75,000 or more are much more likely. The difference here, just because I can't hover here, but if you go to the report itself, you'd be able to see the numbers. We see that in the $75,000 or more range, we have 92% of adults that have home broadband service. And for that lowest bracket there, it's actually 56%. So it's a really big difference. I think looking at this chart, it's clear that there's a clear causal relationship here, right? And some of that actually has to do with cost of service. This FCC report is based on a survey that they do every year. And we saw that 51% of the 6 million US households with income under $25,000 did not have home internet because they said it was too expensive. We actually see a really similar pattern with education level as well. So I pulled the same chart here looking at percent of adults who have home broadband users, broken out by their education levels. And we see a very similar pattern. So if we look at the blue line on the bottom here, we see that those with less than high school, those that are less than high school graduates are considerably less likely to have home broadband at home than those who are college graduates or higher. So we see here, the patterns are the same. It's very similar to what we've talked about in previous webinars. This particular group, those who have lower income households as well as lower education levels, were disproportionately affected by the pandemic, and we're seeing that they have fewer resources available to them. So looking at these reports, we can understand some really broad strokes, right? We can understand that those who have the lower education income level are less likely. But if we use Gale Analytics, we can get a lot more specific. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to switch to our dashboard here. Can you see that okay? Great. Okay, so a little refresher. I know I have spoken to a number of the people in this room before, so I don't want to get too primitive here, but Gale Analytics does provide quite a bit of information, and we can look at a lot of things at the household level, things like household income and education level, like we just talked about, as well as Mosaic segmentation, which we'll dive into a little bit more. But what we do is we append that information at the household level, and then we'll aggregate it so that you can see kind of how it breaks down within your service area. So what we're looking at here is the patron measures tab, and you can see a number of things that are here. Full disclosure, we did roll out some updates last week, so it might look a little different than what you're used to, but all of the same information is in here. And I'll talk about how the functionality has changed, if at all, as we go along. And so if we look at the patron measures tab here, we're looking at a number of demographics that we do analyze at the household level. So we have, the first two along the top are the household income and education level, as we discussed. We also have presence of children, length of residence. And then of course we have that mosaic breakdown on the right-hand side here. We can use the built-in filters in Gale Analytics here to try to identify some of the populations we just talked about. So, the two groups we talked about again are the lower income levels and lower education levels. And you'll see on the right-hand side that we have those filters built in so that we can identify or subset these particular groups. So if we wanted to look at those with a high school diploma or less, we could do that. For our example, I'm going to use household income. So I'm going to select the households that have a household income less than $50,000. And you'll see that as I select the filters, all of the charts are rearranging so that they are only keeping in the households that fall into the groups that I selected. So what we're looking at here is we're looking at the household incomes with $50,000 or less. We look at households, understanding what the breakdown of presence of children and length of residence. We as well can look at their education levels to understand how that differs for this particular group, and then the mosaic breakdown. Now, I'm going to come back to the patron measures tab in just a minute, but I do want to show you a few things too. I'm going to skip to the patrons and non-patrons map. So one of the nice things that is part of our update here is that we have one map now, and what you can do is you can choose how to color code that map. What we're looking at first is the patrons and non-patrons. So you'll see that the blue dots are patrons and the gray dots are non-patrons. If you wanted to color code by household income, for example, we could do that. So again, keep in mind, you'll see from the legend on the top right corner that we did only keep in a handful of income buckets, but the households that are here are now color coded by those buckets. So you can see kind of how they scatter and how they distribute within the service area. I'm going to skip back to patrons and non-patrons here. So one thing to think about, right, is that we selected a group that we know were disproportionately affected by the pandemic in different ways, especially for internet connectivity. We can see on the map kind of where they distribute within the service area, patrons and non-patrons. If we wanted to take it a step further and understand how that overlays with the racial and ethnic groups within the service area, we can do that as well. So you'll notice here, similar to what we talked about in previous webinars, the census tracts are color-coded by the density of different racial and ethnic groups, which we can select in the top left-hand corner here. And of course, we can still select the color coding as well. For the purposes of our webinar today, I'm going to go back to the patron measures tab to talk about kind of how we're going to use this information to understand who uses the internet and who doesn't. So as we talked about before, we know that the lower income and lower education level households are those that are most affected in terms of internet connectivity, amongst other things. So one of the things that I selected here, of course, was the estimated household income brackets to select the lower income households. And now what I would like to do is I would like to get to know who this group is. Understanding that we have this mosaic breakdown here, understanding how many households or what % of households fall into each of these groups, we can get a good sense of which of the mosaic segments are most prominent within our service area. And then we can go into the segmentation portal and really understand, who they are, what is the best way to support them, and then taking it a step further, what is the best way to communicate with them? Making sure we can get that message to them in a way that's relevant to them, that they are receptive to, that they'll be able to understand what is available to them through the library. So looking here, we see the top 3 are philanthropic sophisticates, which is about 33% of the service area, enjoying retirement, which is about 8%, and consummate consumers, which is also about 8%. So looking at those top 3, that accounts for more than 40% of the lower income households in the service area. For the purposes of our webinar today, I'll go through philanthropic sophisticates since that's the largest group. We can talk about what their interests are, what their behaviors are, what are some of the ways to support this particular group, and then knowing that they aren't likely to use the internet as much, what is the best way to reach them? I see somebody raise their hand here.
That's me.
Oh, okay. Go ahead.
So I'm just trying to keep up. So you're back at the patron measures with no filter, right? This is the mosaic.
So this is the breakdown for those lower income household levels. So
good.
Yeah,
That makes more sense.
Yeah, within the dashboard, those filters do persist across tabs and don't come off. The filters don't turn off until you turn them off specifically. So as I was tabbing through, we were looking specifically at this particular group of the lower income households. We could also layer them too. So if we wanted to look specifically at lower income, lower education, we could do that as well. But for the purposes of our webinar today, and especially because we're looking at a small sample in Farmington Hills, I'm going to look only at estimated household income to start, and then we can kind of talk through that.
Yeah,
I think that was a really good question.
Just wanted to clarify.
Yep. Okay, so I'm going to go into the segmentation portal next, and we can start to look at philanthropic sophisticates, get to know them a little bit better, talk about the data points that are available, and understand, what are some of the things that we should be doing to support this particular population. So switch here. I have a feeling it's going to log me out. So let me log back in. Okay. So once we get into the segmentation portal, which you should have access to through Gale Analytics, you can go to the Understand tool here, and we'll go to Types. And this is where we see the 71 Mosaic segments that are part of the model. So we're going to go to Philanthropic Sophisticates, which is C13. When we look at the summary panel here, we understand a few things about them. So there are things like key features, who we are. So these are the most prominent summary statistics for this particular group, as well as channel preference. I'm going to skip this for the most part today. I'm going to dig into the data itself, and we'll talk about how to read the different numbers. But just know when you go into the segmentation portal, this is the first thing you'll see for each of the segments. So if we go on the left-hand navigation, we'll see a column chart here. If you click on that, we can start to get some really good details on each of the Mosaic segments. Each of the data points for each of the Mosaic segments. So there are things like who we are, head of household gender, head of household age. There are two different ways to look at the data. So what we're looking at first is the relativity index. And really what that means is that we're trying to understand how likely or not likely this particular group is to exhibit any of these characteristics. So to talk about the index just a little bit, the way that it works is that it anchors at 100. So any value below 100 means that they're not likely to exhibit that characteristic or be part of that group. Anything above 100 means that they are, and the distance from 100 is the intensity factor. So, thinking about the scale starts at 0 to 100. So a value of 0 means that they're not at all likely to be part of that group. Again, 100 is just as likely as the average American household. And then how the different distance from 100 gives you the likelihood that they will be. So the distance from 100 can vary. For the most part, you see values between 100 and 300. Sometimes it goes much higher if it's really that much more likely than the average American household. I've seen values as high as 14 or 1500. Just know that the distance is what gives you that intensity factor. It's what allows you to make that value judgment of whether they are likely enough to be prioritized by your library. The other way to look at it is means. So if you click on this column chart here, mean, percent, or value, what you're starting to see instead are the percentage of households within philanthropic sophisticates that fall into this category. So in this case, they're saying that for philanthropic sophisticates, 21.2% of households have a head of household gender that is female, and 78.8% head of household gender that is male. For the most part, I like to look at the index, but I think that they're both really valuable and can tell you different things. So just know that they are both there. We'll talk about the index mostly today to talk about the likelihood that they fall into each of these categories to help you determine, what's the best way to support this particular group. So if we look at who we are, there are a number of things about the households we can see, things like head of household gender, head of household age, family structure, ethnicity, which I here. We can look at the presence of a child, so that's a child of any age. If we want to get more granular, we can look at age of children. So specifically here, it's important to note that they are not likely to have children of any age in the household. So that's good to know, right? This is not a group that we'd want to reach out to about summer reading or family literacy workshops. In particular, this group is not likely to have children. So that's something that's really important to know. There's information like where we live, length of residency, urbanicity, how we get by, so head of household age or head of household occupation. I'm going to keep skipping through these because they're not as relevant for us today, but there is information on financial circumstance like estimated household income, discretionary spend. One thing to note about the segmentation model is that it's really wonderful because it's so comprehensive and it's used across many different industries. Now, with that being said, there are probably 500 or 600 data points in here, and a lot of them are not going to be as relevant to libraries, but they are relevant to other companies who use this type of data. So, things like consumer confidence or home expenditures may not be as interesting to you right now, but there are uses for it, and there are things that we can use these for as proxies later, which is something I'm always happy to work with people on as you go through. So I'm going to keep skipping through, but we will talk about what's in here just so you can see it, especially for those who haven't had time to dig into the portal before. There's information like what we drive for those people who are in the market, for those people who own their cars. I'm going to go ahead and dig into how we live our lives, because this is where we can start to see things like behaviors and interests. So if we look at things like arts and entertainment, we can see what type of music they like to listen to, whether they've attended, aquariums, concerts, dance performances, live theater, museums, that kind of thing. A couple of things to note here. So I'm going to skip back up here. If we look at, for this particular group, philanthropic sophisticates, the types of things they're likely to do are things like attending a concert, a dance performance, or a live theater, which, I have talked to Amanda about on the last webinars. It always seems a little bit outdated, given that many of us are not attending any of these things right now. However, we do know that this is data over the last, 2 years or so, and this is something that they're likely to do compared to others. And so thinking about, kind of more normal times, thinking about things like attending concerts, dance performance, and live theater, something like that could be really relevant for libraries, thinking about the kinds of programming that libraries offer. I think on the one hand, there's the big bucket of programming that's kind of learning based. It's more about classes, it's more about learning skills. And then there's also more of the cultural programming, which can be author talks, it can be performances, it could be cultural festivals. And so this is the kind of thing where we can start to learn what some of the behaviors and interests of different groups are, to understand if any of this is relevant for them, if this is the kind of library service that they'd like to learn more about or hear more about. The other thing in this particular group, looking at things like aquariums, museums, or zoos. I know a lot of libraries have partnerships with some of the community organizations that fall into these categories. That could be something like museum pass lending, or that could be something like programming where a library that I used to work with, they would bring animals into the library as a partnership with one of the bird sanctuaries that was close by. So thinking about that kind of thing too can give you a good sense of whether different households would be receptive to messages about that kind of programming or that kind of offering. There's information about gaming, so thinking about what types of gaming systems and what kind of games they play. This, a lot of the times, can be really relevant for hackathons or other kinds of programming around gaming. We see this group is not particularly likely to game, but do know that that information is in there. If we think about leisure activities and hobbies, there's information on things like memberships to AARP, whether they attend a church, temple, or synagogue, whether they are members of a union. So you can imagine that these can give you some information on different places that you can go for partnerships or for any kind of marketing to be able to reach some of these folks. We see that all three of these that we talked about are likely for this particular group. So it would be a good place to kind of start for them. And we can also get some information on content too. So we see, thinking about reading, right? We have a lot of information here about how this group likes to read, if they like to read. And we see that they like to read physical books, they like to listen to audiobooks and read ebooks on both Kindle and Nook, though not so much the tablet. And so, this group would be a really good candidate for messages about the physical collections. What's changing? How are things changing? Are they able to browse? Where can they browse? Is it at specific locations? Are there bookmobile stops? Right? Knowing that this is a group that's likely to read physical books means that, they would be a good candidate to talk to about, how things are changing in terms of the collection itself or the processes around it at the library. We also see that they like to listen to audiobooks and ebooks on Kindle and Nook, so they would also be a really good candidate for messages about digital collections. That could be spotlighting new acquisitions, that could be featuring collection items or different ways to access ebooks and e-audiobooks. Just know that, we have this information for each of the 71 segments, and so we can start to understand what is the most relevant message for each group, and we'll continue on to talk about how to reach them with that message as well. Going down the list, we also have information on things like education courses. So again, as we talked about with the programming, there's kind of a few big buckets, one of them being learning-based courses. So knowing that this group is interested in learning-based courses, it would be interesting to let them know about some that are available to them. Again, we know that this is a group that's not particularly likely to have internet at home. And so understanding that, we can think about whether we want to talk about some of the digital courses that are available to them, as well as what's available to them in person once in person starts up again. And of course, there's other content areas here like needleworking, quilting, painting and drawing, photography, a lot of the things that I know libraries are offering program and resources on. There's also information on things like magazines and newspapers, so what types of magazines they are likely to read, as well as newspapers. The one that I want to highlight here, which is something they implemented last year, was digital magazine and newspaper buyers. We see that this group is not particularly likely to do so, which again, not surprising, knowing that this group is not very likely to be using the internet at home. But this is something that's available in here so we can start to understand, who is the right audience for things like RB Digital or any other kind of resource you have around digital magazines and newspapers available through the library. So I'm going to go ahead and continue forward. Things like sports interests and travel, we'll skip those for now. What is our digital life is going to be where we start to learn more about what they're doing on the internet if they're using the internet. So if I click on internet usage here, we have a number of data points that are really interesting. A couple of things like whether they use the internet to make personal purchases, whether they socialize on the internet, skipping down a little bit more, preparing taxes online. This one is the one that I think is the most interesting, use internet at home. This gives us a good sense of whether they use the internet at home. We see here that the value of 109, which is very close to 100, means that they are just about as likely as the average American household. And so as we saw before, there is a wide range of the percentage of people who do use the internet at home in each of the income brackets. But we'll be using this data point a little bit later to identify those who do use the internet at home to be able to reach them in the same way. So if we keep looking here at their digital life, we can see a lot more information, what they are likely to do if they're using the internet. And as we see here, not really particularly likely to be using many of these websites. So the one thing they do use is news. So they're interested in reading digital news when they are able to use the internet. So it's something to consider. We did see that they're not likely to purchase digital magazines and newspapers, but they are likely to read digital news, on a browser. So that's definitely something that's interesting to know here. One of the things about digital news that I actually think is really interesting. So Amanda and I were discussing an article yesterday about the digital divide. And one of the things that the article had mentioned was that a lot of members of the community look to the library for access to information, but they're also looking at or looking for information on how to navigate the internet and how to discern what information is, that they read is trustworthy and something that they can believe. And so, I've seen a lot of libraries who have programs that have content focuses on identifying fake news or things that are, other resources available to help us, users better understand the news that they're reading. So, thinking about this particular group who's not particularly digitally savvy, this would be a great group to promote resources like those two, right? Different resources you have to help people understand how best to discern the information they're reading, how to understand what's trustworthy and what's not. So skipping forward a little bit more. So what is our digital life? If we look at technology adoption, one of the things that they do here is they categorize households into their level of technology adoption into 4 categories. We see that this group is most likely to be apprentices, which is medium to low. Thinking about the technology adoption, this can kind of help you plan for them too. So this group would benefit from any kind of virtual program around specifically using technology. That could be things like beginning Microsoft Office classes or classes on navigating social media. This group is not particularly digitally savvy, and so they could learn from and benefit from classes like that are more beginner and helping them use the technology that could be available to them in the future. I'm going to skip past these just to show you a few of the other ones that are available. So if we look at things like how we view the world, there's information like political party affiliation, attitudes about food, general attitudes and opinions, media consumption, contributions. There's a lot of information in here that we could use, I think, for the purposes of our webinar and to be very mindful of our time today. I'm going to skip most of those, but know that there's a lot of more information here that you could access if you wanted to learn more about this particular group and how you can support them in different ways. But next, we're going to talk about what's the best way to reach this group. So there are 2 different ways that I like to look at that. First, we're going to talk about how we prefer communications, the engagement channel, and then we'll talk about social media as well. So if we click on how we prefer communications engagement channel, and I'll click on TrueTouch SM, we can see here that we have a pretty granular breakdown of different engagement channels that people are likely to engage with. And so, what we're looking at here again is that relativity index. We see that this particular group is receptive to digital news. So again, no surprise, we saw in the digital life category that they do like to read digital news. They are receptive to marketing via email as well as direct mail. So that's something that's really important to note, right? We know that there are a lot of things that we've identified already as things that would be good for this group, things that the library can do to support them, things that are available already through the library that they simply may not know about. And so now the question that we have to ask is, what is the best way to reach them? How do we vary that marketing message to make sure that we're sending something that is relevant to them in a way that they are receptive to, in a way that they would interact with the message itself. And so, thinking about this group, again, we always have to take a step back, right? Think about how this group is not particularly digitally savvy, also does not necessarily have the internet at home. And so looking at these three categories, we could do a direct mail campaign. I think that would probably be the best way to go for this particular group. I also think email is not a particularly bad idea, only because the way that the Gale Analytics mailing list feature is set up is that we have email addresses for patrons. And so these are people you already have a relationship with who have submitted their email address to receive communications that way. So that would probably be the best way to reach this particular group. In a minute, I'm going to switch over to Gale Analytics to talk about how we can build some of those targeted marketing campaigns, both for direct mail and email. But before we get out of the portal here, I'm going to talk a little bit about social media as well. So if we click on social media and we click on the TrueTouch SM there, we see that there are quite a few platforms here that they do analyze when they're trying to understand, who falls into each of these categories. And we see that for this particular group, they're not very heavy social media users, but they are likely to use LinkedIn and to some extent Facebook as well. These wouldn't be a terrible way to go. I think that because we know that this group is not particularly digitally savvy, that social media is probably not the best way to reach them. But if you wanted to put some content out there, it's relatively low cost and low effort. And so, if you wanted to kind of dabble with that, see if it works, LinkedIn and Facebook would be the two platforms to prioritize in this case. So I will go back to the dashboard. Can you see the dashboard? Okay, yes. Great. So as we said before, we have the estimated household income here still selected. So, we'll see that what we're looking at here is just this particular group of households. And if we go to the mailing list tab, this is meant to help you create, targeted mailing campaigns. If I click on the estimated household income here, we'll see that we still have those selected. So we're looking at the lower income households specifically. On the bottom left-hand corner, we see that the total filtered households is 1,021. So that's how many households fall into the filters that we selected. And you'll see a really nice clean mailing list here. So what it shows is a very clean address and suite, city, state, and zip. And there is a field for email address, which is currently blank because we're just using our sample Gale Public Library data. However, as Amanda said, when you're generating a dashboard or running a report, you can include email address for patrons where you have it, and we will attach it to the households here so that when we do some of this filtering, we'll have the patron email addresses that you have provided attached to those households. So I'm going to take the filters a little bit deeper, and I'm going to select the mosaic that we were just looking at. So in this case, it's philanthropic sophisticates. So now we're looking at those lower household income that are philanthropic sophisticates, and we see that the total filtered households is 338. So if we wanted to do some kind of a targeted campaign here to be able to send them a relevant message talking about some of the services that are available to them that we know would be of interest to them, we could do a mailing campaign. So you could export this, and there's some instructions up here on how to export the mailing list. Same goes for email address. If you want to do an email campaign, essentially what would happen is you would export this list of 338 households, both with their mailing address and their email address. And then you could use any kind of mail platform, email or direct mail, in order to start that campaign. Okay, so I'm going to now switch back to the portal, and I want to talk a little bit about how we can go through a somewhat similar process for households that are likely to use the internet. Now, for this particular group, we would want to be able to understand who is likely to use the internet using some of those data points. So as we talked about with what is our digital life, we did talk about how there is a data point that says, uses internet at home. So we're going to use a different tool within the segmentation portal to say, show me the Mosaic segments that are likely to use the internet at home. I'll go back to the portal here. We go back to the segmentation portal homepage, we can click on audience. And this works slightly differently, though it does pull the same information. So instead of looking at a particular group and then looking at all their characteristics, what we can do is we can select the characteristic and say, show me the groups that are likely to engage in this behavior or to be part of this group. So if we click on internet usage and we click use internet at home, I'm going to switch the radio button to type. So we have the granular Mosaic segments, and then I'll view quick stats. So here we'll see the list rank ordered of the groups that are likely to use internet at home. We'll see that D17 is the highest, A03, and so on. For the purposes of our webinar today, I'm going to use A03 because I know that this is a population that we see a little bit more prominently within our service area. And what we can do is we can do something really similar, right? So I'm going to do this one a little bit faster just because we've looked at a lot of the information and talked about what's available. But we will go through for A03 to kind of understand what they're interested in and then also understand what's the best way to communicate with them. So if we go back to the portal, click on understand, we'll go to types, A03, which is kids in Cabernet, one of my favorite names. I like the names of these segments a lot because I think they're really funny. So here we have kids in Cabernet. Again, we have that summary page, a little bit of information about this particular group. If we go in the left-hand navigation, we have that column chart. We can start to understand them a little bit better. So again, I'm just going to go through the things that I have identified already as things that are interesting. We see that this group is very likely to have children. Not surprising, their name is kids in Cabernet. If we want to know more granularly the age of children, we see that it's children of all ages. So this is a group that would be a really good candidate to learn more about any kind of family offerings you have. That could be story time, out of school time programs, summer reading, technology and coding classes for kids, really anything you have that's meant to support families. Kids of all ages would be relevant here. So if we go down to how we live our lives, we go into arts and entertainment. Again, we see this group is likely to have attended aquariums, museums, and zoos. So they would be a great candidate for marketing around, any programs that partner with organizations like this or museum pass lending, just let them know anything you have around that as well. If we go to leisure activities and hobbies, we see that this group also likes to read. They like to read physical books as well as ebooks on all platforms and listening to audiobooks. So again, same thing here. This group would be great to talk to about changes to physical collections or processes around them, as well as ebooks and audiobooks that are available to them and how to access them. Let's see, if we go to what is their digital life, just like the last group, we can talk about, how do they use the internet? We know that this group is likely to use the internet at home. And so we can see how they use the internet. We can see that this group likes to book travel online. They also look at websites like ESPN. They like to read digital news. So there's a lot here that we can talk about that would really be relevant for this group, things that they would be interested in, things that you could communicate to them about. And looking at their technology adoption, we see that this group has higher technology adoptions. They're in the journeyman category. That's medium to high technology adoption. So, I think for this group, it's less about how to use the technology and more about how to use the technology effectively, right? Being able to incorporate technology into the programming, thinking about how this group has digital access. This is a group that you can talk to a lot about the digital offerings that are available to them, whether that's e-resources or virtual programming. This is a group that you would want to communicate more, those kinds of offerings as well. And so finally, we can talk about engagement too. So if we look about the engagement channels, thinking about marketing, this group is receptive to marketing via digital news. They are email receptive, mobile SMS, streaming TV, and broadcast streaming TV. So these are all different ways that you can reach them. I'm not surprised at all that these are the categories we see for this particular group, knowing that they're likely to use the internet at home and they are very digitally savvy. For this group, I would say, an email campaign is always great, especially for, existing patrons. But of course, if you wanted to go a different route, if you wanted to reach non-patrons, some of these other digital channels are a great way to go. Digital news, you can do an ad banner. or streaming TV or broadcast streaming TV. I've seen a lot of libraries do some ads that are specific to either streaming or broadcast to be able to get that message out there as well. Thinking about social media, finally, we also see that this group is pretty heavy on social media on all platforms. Again, not surprising, right? This group is digitally savvy. There are kids of all ages in the household. So they are using social media on all platforms. So thinking about, the different social media channels that your library is using, this would be a great way to get that message out there, relatively low cost, relatively low effort, and a really good way to reach a pretty broad audience here. So I'm going to switch back again to the dashboard, and I'm switching around a little bit. But if we go here to the mailing list again, we can talk about how to build a targeted email list for this group. So we saw they were email receptive. So I'm going to go ahead and reset the filters. And I'm going to select Kids in Cabernet here. We see that this includes 378 households. And again, we can build a campaign here, right? So this is the beginnings of a targeted marketing campaign. So we have just the Kids in Cabernet households. We saw that email addresses, email campaign is the way to go. So what we would do is we would export this mailing list. We would have that list of email addresses, and we would know that there are a number of things that we can talk to them about. We can talk to them about digital offerings. We can talk to them about anything that's meant to support families or children, anything around reading. So physical collections, changes in the processes, changes in the collection, as well as, ebooks and audiobooks that are available to them as well. Okay. So I'm going to switch to our PowerPoint here and just talk about our summary, our key takeaways. So when you're thinking about, who uses the internet, who doesn't, and how to reach them best, there are a couple different things that we can do. So first, we start with identifying the groups that do and don't use the internet. The way that we did it today was to use external context to help us identify populations that were most effective in terms of internet connectivity. We did that more for those who don't use the internet. And I think that for our purposes today, that was kind of dual purpose, right? Understanding who is most affected, especially as a result of the pandemic. And then what we did for the second group to understand who does use the internet, we used the Experience Segmentation Portal to identify the segments that fit our criteria. So in this case, we were looking for those who use internet at home. Now, once we've identified those groups, we dug into the segmentation portal a little bit deeper. And what we did was we gained a better understanding of the identified Mosaic segments to tailor the message that we were sending to targeted groups. So, talking about the services to prioritize that would best support each group, as well as understanding the best way to reach those groups to make sure that we are varying those marketing messages and making them as relevant as we can to each group. And then finally, the last step is to plan the targeted communications. So as we said, we want to tailor those messages. We want to make sure that we are promoting the messages that are most relevant to the group that would support them, especially now, and to think about the best communication channels to reach those groups to make sure they get the message and that they understand what's available to them through the library.